Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, December 14th, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 5 and the 27th webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee. I'm turning the webinar over to him now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate the opportunity once again to be with you and our other participants. We are now on the verge of conducting our final webinar in the current series leading up to the year-end holidays. And in honor of those holidays, I decided to wear a red sweater with a green tie. So I have just identified the symbolism. In any event, we will be continuing our discussion essentially where we left off last week. For viewers who have not been following our series, I should explain that it is predominantly based on a rather long discussion document called Revelation Revealed that I wrote in 2016. But that, on the other hand, our discussion today will be oriented toward an essay that is a supplement and will eventually be an insert in Revelation Revealed that I wrote in June. This essay is called Living the Real Religion of Jesus. And for those of you who are watching, it would be very helpful for you to have that document in front of you as we are discussing, because you will be able to follow along in terms of the ideas that we are talking about. In order to download the document, you would go to the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, which is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. The link that will enable you to download my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, is about 2/3 of the way down the page. It's very, very close to the link for the longer document, Revelation Revealed. In any case, you, the viewer, do not have the opportunity to ask us questions while we are discussing these matters, and therefore we offer you an alternative possibility. You could send us a question or perhaps several questions by email. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address at the bottom of the homepage of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, namely info@globalendeavor.net. If you send us a question, we reserve the right to edit the wording, and we might wish to use it as the basis for discussion during a future webinar. In that event, the question would be discussed by the entire panel of people participating that day. You would not simply get a response from me personally. So now, gentlemen, and I have to say gentlemen because unfortunately we do not have any female participants today, we will resume where we left off last week, specifically on page 6 of my document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, at the top of which the page begins with 2 quotations from remarks by Melchizedek that appear in papers 92 and 98, talking about the relationship of Christianity to the Western psychology, and also talking about certain difficulties that have caused it to be a bit strange in the viewpoint of people who live in other parts of the world. We have been discussing various aspects of these 2 excerpts for several webinars now, and we reached a point at which the group had answered several questions that I posed in regard to these 2 excerpts. The final question has to do with the relationship between the Christian teachings and different elements. This was question 4. The first of those elements was the theology of Judaism. The second element pertained to the inheritance from Zoroastrianism, and then the third element, the inheritance from Greek theology. We have almost finished that last part, the inheritance from Greek theology. I simply have one final element of discussing the heritage to Christianity from Greek theology that I would like the panel to discuss today, that I will soon ask you questions about. And this is how the inheritance from Greek theology and its psychology of belief and understanding combined together with the Roman tradition of uniformity and authoritarian control that likewise was a very important element in Christianity as it developed. In other words, I am asking about the relationship between the two elements, Greek theology and Roman authoritarianism, and how these two elements combine together in ways that influence Christianity as it developed. Now, I'm not sure who would like to join us on that particular point first, but since Marvin has returned to our operation after other possibilities and other obligations of his, I will give him the first opportunity to offer views on the relationship. Marvin?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best equipped to respond to that question because I don't consider myself really very well versed in either Greek philosophy or Roman authoritarianism culturally. But running with your theme, Neil, the one thought that occurs to me is my recollection that the two are opposed in some sense. My recollection about Greek philosophy was that it was in its ethos, in its sort of desired process, it was a process of inquiry that was sort of fluid and very creative. The Socratic method, I think I'm being, or I get it mixed up, the methodology where one teaches by asking questions. It was a philosophy profoundly based on looking at actual human experience and trying to decipher what are the generalizations, the philosophical principles that flow from what we experience and what our lives are about. So it was a very creative endeavor and open to inquiry in a very broad sense. And to me, that's sort of flies in the face of the Roman need for conformity, that or authoritarianism. That said, also politically, I think the Romans were very shrewd and astute in allowing for a great deal of individual cultural manifestation in the groups that they conquered, as long as they gave political loyalty to the emperor and to the Roman system of government. As long as that was going on and the individual cultural manifestation of the local cultures didn't interfere with their authority and the taxes being paid and the stability of the structure, they were fine with individual cultural movement. So I'm not sure if that relates to where you're trying to go with this, Neil. But I think in Christianity you have both those strands. You have strands of creative exploration in many respects in the history of Christianity, and you have usually politically the need for loyalty and domination from central authorities in terms of the polity many times. So I think you see both those influences in some senses battling each other and interweaving in the history of Christianity.
Thank you, Marvin. I respect your desire to portray your own knowledge as limited, but I think you gave us a very good introduction to this question. If we look at history, the origin of Greek philosophy occurred in a period of city-states in which there was a great diversity of political expression as well as a great diversity of intellectual expression. And by the time of the appearance of Jesus on earth, this had greatly yielded to a Hellenistic system of different regimes descending from the Empire of Alexander, but split up into different parts. Whereas the Romans had done away with that. In effect, the Hellenistic kingdom of Egypt under Cleopatra was the last major segment of the former Greek empire established by Alexander that came under Roman authority. And so, indeed, there was an issue of unity and uniformity. The Romans spoke Latin, but all educated persons in the Roman Empire were bilingual, Latin as well as Greek. So now we have an interplay of linguistic dimensions whereby, to my understanding, the Greek language is more complex in terms of its grammatical patterns and possibilities of explanation than the Latin languages. Whereas Christianity started in the eastern half of the Mediterranean, and Greek was the language of theology for centuries and centuries. The Council of Nicaea in the year 325 of the current era was conducted in Greek, not in Latin. And to my understanding, very few bishops from the western half of the Roman Empire attended. So anyway, now we go back to the question of uniformity. I wonder if Andre could add to the idea that Marvin expressed, that there was a kind of opposition to these two elements.
You know, I would echo Marvin in first of all saying I don't feel like I have a great deal of expertise on this subject, but here's what strikes me. Is that the authoritarian character of Roman rule certainly was echoed in the evolution of the Catholic Church. And very soon, a hierarchy developed, which was part of the ecclesiastical structure that was evolving as part of Catholicism. And I don't have much more to say other than that, but that took what had been a fairly democratic movement, or at least with leaders that were willing to honor all of the members on an almost equal basis, and started to develop hierarchy where there were those that had more to say on the subject of religion and theology than say the laity, or what evolved as a concept of clergy and laity. And to me, that changes the character enormously. I grew up in a church that had that as a legacy, where they spoke, I listened. And that was the essence of my religious education. That is very, very different than other more democratic kinds of associations. For instance, Quakers, where anyone who is moved by the Spirit, even though there are certain protocols around that, can speak in a meeting of the Friends. And so that's what occurs to me right away. That's one of the main legacies, and that caused a lot of problems historically, in that certain people made leadership decisions that frankly have colored the development of Christianity forevermore from that. The Crusades among them would be an excellent example of where we might have gone wrong in following the teachings of Jesus, in promulgating the truths that we associated with Christianity.
Thank you, Andre. I would pursue you slightly in regard to your original contention that the early years of the Christian movement, the movement that eventually became Christianity as we knew it, was very tolerant and open. If we look at the epistles ascribed to Paul, the Apostle Paul, he did not seem to me to be very tolerant. There was room for a variety of opinions, provided that you agreed with him, most explicitly agreed with him.
Mhm.
And so the theology of Christianity started off from Paul's interpretations. And then there was a great deal of theorizing that we can associate with the tradition of Greek philosophy. But the Romans landed on this and decided to enforce uniformity on all the details that their co-religionists speaking Greek had managed to come up with.
Hmm.
And perhaps your take on this as the principle of stifling other views actually did end up dominating the Christian pattern. George, would you take a look at that? Are we talking about a religion that became explicit and detailed because of Greek philosophy, but then became overwhelming and authoritarian because of Roman cultural influences?
It's a really good question. I'm not a historian of these matters either, but there was, found a couple of very interesting passages in the text. Let me just bring it up, which seem to suggest that the relationship between the Romans, the Greeks, and the Hebrews who originally promulgated Christianity, namely Paul and his successors, they see, instead of being oppositional, it appears they're suggesting there was a tripartite arrangement between these three groups. And let me just read, this is from paper 195, section 2. Oriental law was stern and arbitrary. Greek law was fluid and artistic. Roman law was dignified and respect-breeding. Roman education bred an unheard of and stolid loyalty. The early Romans were politically devoted and sublimely consecrated individuals. And these Romans were a great people. They could govern the Occident because they did govern themselves. Such unparalleled honesty, devotion, and stalwart self-control was ideal soil for the reception and growth of Christianity. It was easy for these Greco-Romans to become just as spiritually devoted to an institutional church as they were politically devoted to the state. The Roman provided a unity of political rule, the Greek a unity of culture and learning, Christianity a unity of religious thought and practice. So, I certainly see how these different cultural, attitudes, certainly they are oppositional in some sense, but it seems that they came together and found a way to form a sort of tripartite culture. The Romans provided political rule, the Greeks provided, philosophy and education. Christianity provided the religion.
Thank you, George. I think the passage that you quoted has many interesting elements, and I appreciate the fact that you brought it forward for us. Bob, you turn out to be the cleanup hitter here, and I'm using that in the colloquial sense, not implying that there's anything that you need to clean up in the household framework. But I would like to add one element to the problem before you. And this is the element of the chosen people syndrome that we discussed last week and perhaps the week before. Now, the chosen people syndrome descending from Judaism and inflicted upon Christianity had deep theological roots, but it also had a resemblance to earlier pagan beliefs, whereby the Romans believed that they had to appease their gods, and that a particular god would protect Rome if and only if appropriate worship were directed toward that god. So now I'm wondering whether this idea of appeasing God and doing the right thing was an underlying psychological imperative for the Romans perhaps with the view that if they did not get the religion right and did not enforce conformity on the part of all Roman citizens, God might punish the Roman Empire and might not help its armies prevail in whatever wars they were undertaking at the time.
So that's a theory that you've propounded toward me here.
I'm offering it to you as a possibility, simply for you to comment on.
A hypothesis. Well, that's interesting because you've kind of taken a little curveball on where the question was started. The question that you started was this almost, and I think you brought it up earlier, this conflict between belief and practice, uniformity of belief and the uniformity of practice. Let me center on that. I'll try to get back to this difference between chosen people and trying to appease a God. I saw it as a conflict when you first posed that question. I was kind of wondering, where you were going with the question. But there isn't any doubt that the Greek language, the Greek philosophical thought didn't have a uniformity of belief because they were philosophical. And that's essentially what a philosophy will do. It'll try to drag the wisdom. And as Marvin brought up, it was a Socratic method where you ask the questions and, the response would be diversified, pluralistic. And I see that as in conflict with the uniformity of the practice that the Romans brought to it. And I think both George and Andre brought that up equally. I was about to also say pretty much like everyone has said that, I'm not an expert on Greek philosophy, but I found it interesting as I was reflecting upon the question during the week that I think all of us had the Greek mythology someplace in our basic schooling. I don't know if they teach anymore. I don't think they do. But I can remember being in 8th grade and or 9th grade, I should say, trying to figure out why is all of this Greek mythology being portrayed to me. I think it was a remnant probably of the curriculum that had strong roots in the Christianity. I was certain of that. So I see it also, Neil, as a conflict. George's idea of this tripartite idea is very interesting, political, philosophical, and religious coming all together. I promise I'll get to your curveball question here in a second. The part that I wanted to bring up was it's actually in paper 121. Paper 120 starts part 4 of the papers, and it provides us a look into the Union of Days, who gave Michael his edict, I should say, or his rules of the road, maybe is the best way to say it, for his bestowal. But the next paper then talks about the environment by which the bestowal took part. And I think that where this question and what we've just talked about gets to this, gets to the heart of this. And this is, a lot of these things that we're talking about really require almost a complete series of webinars, and it's almost hard to do this in one short spurt. And I'd just like to read something from paper 121. And just one quick second. I have a.
Well, Bob came off with the word marching orders or guidance. I would be inclined to use instructions in terms of what Emmanuel said to Michael before he left Salvington, if you can accept that.
Yeah, yes. I had a 2-year-old at the door there. I had to shush out there, so sorry about that.
He wasn't worried about the relationship between Greek theology and Roman.
Not at the moment, no. We'll have to have a discussion about that probably
All right.
later. Just wanted to bring up something about this the idea of the Greek philosophy, and there's lots in the papers. I just want to bring this one up, and this is from 121:1:1, the very first paragraph, and I'll go into the middle of it. And it says, in the centuries just prior to these times, and these times are the Occident in the first century, Greek culture and the Greek language had spread over the Occident and Near Orient, which is east, of course, of the Levant. And the Jews, being a Levantine race in nature, part Occidental, part Oriental, were eminently fitted to utilize such cultural and linguistic settings for the effective spread of a new religion, both East and West. These most favorable circumstances were further enhanced by the tolerant political rule of the Mediterranean world by the Romans, which is what George brought up. Next sentence is very interesting. It says that the entire combination of world influences is well illustrated by the activities of Paul, who, being in religious culture a Hebrew of the Hebrews, proclaimed the gospel of a Jewish Messiah in the Greek tongue. He himself was a Roman citizen. So there we have that tripartite being described, right up in the beginning about, what this environment was. So Neil, to get to your question about this idea of chosen people, I don't track that exactly the way you see it, and maybe you've got a different perspective. But these in Greek mythology, as I had to reflect back in ninth grade, didn't see a lot of this appeasing or a chosen people. It was almost another conflict, I think. And what I see happening in that particular environment is Paul knowing how to actually combine these three legs of the stool to be able to use the infrastructure and the authority. The uniformity of practice was probably the big element that was able to put voltage to this new religion. But your thought in your question, I think, was, did this give the Roman people a consideration that, well, maybe we better appease these gods? I didn't see that, and I could certainly be disabused of that thought. But just right off the top, I think it was an amalgamation, and the Greek philosophy provided the openness to be able to drop the hierarchy on top of it. Back over to you.
Bob, I think you have combined together certain strands that the other three have put forward, and you have done so persuasively. The question that I gave you and that you described as a curveball was not a denial of any of these elements that the others have talked about, but rather an additional layer of meaning, in the sense that the pagan tradition of individual gods and goddesses always had included the idea that a particular god was on your side in your city. For example, Athena was considered to be the patron of Athens. So if we then move into the era of early Christianity, the persecutions that happened from time to time, not uniformly in the first couple centuries of Christianity, were motivated by an apparent concern of the Romans that these Christians were not giving proper reverence to the Roman gods. And the Roman gods might get angry and punish Rome or punish some part of Rome because they were not being honored appropriately. So what I'm suggesting perhaps is that this psychology of doing appropriate honor to one's god or gods probably contributed to the authoritarianism that the Romans were inclined to practice anyway. That they felt if they refrained from getting it right, or if they did not force all of their subjects to get it right, then God might not favor them. So I'm simply adding that as a possible overlay on the tendency to uniformity and authority that the Romans embodied in the first place. Marvin, you indicated that you have an additional thought that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, to some extent, when you bring up the chosen people question, And I see, I agree with you. To me, it's another layer of a larger overarching question between authoritarianism and free interpretive experiences of religion and philosophy. When I approach that question, my background professionally is in the social sciences, therapy primarily, but also I went back and went a fair ways toward a doctorate at the Graduate Theological Union in the history and sociology of religion. So that's how I see these questions, is from that disciplinary slant. And if you look at a religious group of any size, you are going to see these two tendencies playing out. So this is not unique to Christianity by any chance. And the tendency of chosen people in alignment with authoritarianism, and it's usually authoritarianism in a polity sense, a political or power sense, right? You see religious leaders in positions of power and authority exercising this chosen people construct or executing it. And you see the scribes and Pharisees big time doing it with Jesus to the point where they killed him. And what it is the dynamic of determining who is within the pale and who is outside the pale, you know, and in its current, and it's often in its fundamentalist expressions, those who are not the chosen, who are outside the pale, are consigned to hell, right? To perdition, or one variation or another of that. And so I see this as a broad sociological phenomenon, and it expresses theologically, you know, we are chosen because we believe this, but you get underneath the surface of the phenomenon, and it is we are chosen and you are not, because we are in control and we want to retain control and power and control over resources, often financial and political resources, to the exclusion of you. So we are defining you as outside of the pale theologically as well, and consigned to hell. And lest we think that we are exempt from that tendency, if we, even at our early stage in the Urantia movement, to me, we had a sweet example of exactly this phenomenon when the struggle over the control over the copyright unfolded of the text. One of the things that happened at the peak of the heat of that controversy is certain groups said to other groups, you, with what you're trying to do, are in league with Caligastia. So the chosen people, sociologically, the chosen people dynamic is alive and well wherever humanity functions in groups, and especially in religious function. It's not unique to Christianity. We've experienced it ourselves in camouflaged form, I think.
Thank you, Marvin. I am very sympathetic to your point, and I'm not trying to repeal the laws of human nature. Indeed, I do not have the authority to do that. But the underlying premise of the discussion that we're having has to do with this relationship between Greek thought and Roman political control. Andre and to some degree George both expressed the idea that this somewhat deformed the Christian message by insisting on uniformity. Now, I would like to reach back very briefly to an extended discussion that we conducted in this series of webinars quite some time ago. It had to do with the formulation of the Christian theology of the Trinity and of the spiritual identity of Jesus, wherein there was an extended controversy lasting for over 100 years, largely starting at the time of the Council of Nicaea, but extending until at least the year 451 CE, the Council of Chalcedon. And what emerged from this was a doctrinaire approach to the idea of Jesus's identity that had a minority who were not going along with it. What happened? The Romans, in their principle of uniformity, insisted on the formulation adopted at the Council of Chalcedon. This antagonized Christian believers in Syria, in Palestine, to some lesser degree in Egypt. And these Christian believers continued to have their own view, which distinguished itself from the views of the Eastern Roman Empire, so that by the time that the Arabs emerged in the middle of the 600s, these believers in the eastern part of the Roman Empire were not in sympathy with the imperial authority, and they did not fight very hard to push back the armies of the Prophet. Consequently, Islam rolled into Palestine and Egypt, across northern Africa, and into Spain. And so the presumption of the Roman system of uniformity bit them very hard, because it antagonized major groups of people who did not support the politics of Rome, or at least the politics of the Eastern Empire. And it cost the early Christian era a major share of the terrain on which Christianity had been initiated and flourished. So here we have a consequence of the intersection of Greek philosophy in terms of theological detail with the Roman insistence on uniformity of belief and observance that proved to be politically damaging in a very substantial way. Now, I apologize, colleagues, for giving you a little bit of a history lecture here, but I was trying to agree with Marvin about the implicit tendencies that are built into this situation and, in effect, lead to the conclusion that the insistence on uniformity had very palpable disadvantages on a practical level for the growth of the Roman Empire, or I should say the contraction of the Roman Empire, and for the future of Christianity, wherein it became a Western product that largely lost active association with the realms in which it had flourished in the first place, Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. Does anyone wish to add? Yes, Bob?
Yes, Neil, you brought up the idea of the Trinity. And I didn't bring this up when you asked me the first question, but this is an opportunity to segue into that. There's a very interesting statement in that same paper that I was talking about, the paper 121, which is the environment at the time of the bestowal. And there's a paragraph that I thought was very interesting that talks about the Trinity. And there's, rather than the disadvantages, there's some advantages that actually happen based upon this layering that we're talking about, this psychological and philosophical, theological, political layering. It's almost like we have a mosaic at this period of time that had to play out, and it took a little while for it to play out. Many, but not all, of Philo's inconsistencies. Now, Philo, of course, was the Hebrew of Hebrews, and he was the one that was able to push this Greek philosophical thought back into the times. Many, but not of all, of Philo's inconsistencies resulting from an effort to combine Greek mystical philosophy and Roman Stoic doctrines with the legalistic theology of the Hebrews, Paul recognized and wisely eliminated from his pre-Christian basic theology. Philo led the way for Paul more fully to restore the concept of the Paradise Trinity, which had long been dormant in Jewish theology. I think the concept of the Trinity, to bring it up from the submergence of where it was a real benefit and real significant benefit. Even though the facts may be wrong, the truth still has been able to be saved for a couple thousand years. Maybe that's why Christianity has these core things that they say in paper 196 that there are some aspects of Christianity that will immortalize it. And one other quick point. Last week we were talking about Zoroastrianism, and Andre, you brought up almost in awe about the fact that these Zoroastrians were able to get the idea of the seven master spirits. I think you said, that's a really interesting thing to take note of. Some of these things are submerged, and I think maybe that's why the revelation today, the fifth biblical revelation, is kind of quivering and poised to be able to get back to help support some of these dormant concepts and ideas that have been in dormancy for such a a long time. Back over to you.
Thank you, and I appreciate the focus on the Trinity that you provided, Bob. In recounting the history here, was not really describing the consequences of the diversity after the Council of Chalcedon in the year 451 CE. In relation to the Trinity itself, the great controversies that caused the division pertain to the nature and identity of Jesus, his existence as a being of one nature or two, his existence as a being with one will or two, and so on. And the fact that he was conceived to be the second person of the Trinity as it was then conceived was not really a controversy. It was the insistence on the explicit doctrines adopted at the Council of Chalcedon regarding the identity, nature, prerogatives, and will of Jesus that was the dividing point. So that caused the adverse reactions that I sought to describe before. Personally, I accept the premise that you were advocating, namely that the concept of the Trinity was a notable advantage and an advance, and that this concept in itself did not cause the deep contention that I was seeking to describe. Gentlemen, I think we've done a job on this. The general consensus that I've noted is that the two strands that were the basis of my question in the first place, Greek philosophy and Roman authoritarianism, were in tension at least, and perhaps not exactly a contradiction, but they spun in different directions. And that this combination influenced the development of Christianity for the entire period that we've been discussing, the period of 2,000 years, wherein the premise of authority has not gone away, nor the premise of conformity to established views and the right of leaders to impose those views on believers. None of that has gone away. It may be weaker than it was in previous centuries where people literally could be burned at the stake for having a divergent view. Fortunately, we are not struggling with that. But there is nonetheless a principle of uniformity that is still very deep in many strands of Christianity, not in everyone. I agree. Well, gentlemen, I would now like to proceed with the discussion on the second half of page 6 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Specifically, we will start with the narrative paragraph more or less in the middle of that page that begins with the words, "These social and cultural associations of Christianity." Andre, do you have that available? Would you be willing to read that paragraph for us, please?
I'm right there, yes. These social and cultural associations of Christianity are highly problematic, for it would be ludicrous to assert that the insight and inspiration that we have inherited from the revelators are benefits exclusively aimed at persons who happen to live in the Western world. After all, the fifth epical revelation enshrines God's love and the active ministry of our spiritual superiors for the entirety of Urantia and for everyone who shares our troubled planet with us. Further, the spiritual future of all humanity is intensely interlinked with the religion of personal spiritual experience that Jesus taught and proclaimed.
Thank you. I'm a little bit hesitant to probe for dissenting views on regard to this paragraph because from my own perspective, it would be very difficult to dissent from anything that is said here. I think the question has to do with the relative emphasis that we apply to these conclusions. Emphasis on the one hand of preaching to the choir, people in our own Western culture and civilization, or to the contrary, emphasis on trying to broaden the message so that we step away from Western cultural associations in seeking to adopt and promote the true teachings of Jesus. Now, George, where would you put the balance?
It's a very difficult question. it's, I'm not sure I would actually look at it in terms of balance. Seems to me it's, well, I guess you could say it's balance. I guess thinking more of it in terms of emphasis.
Okay.
There was, in thinking about this question, I came across again something I had forgotten and was amazed the first time I read it. With you bring up the problematic social and cultural associations of Christianity, specifically the cultural matrix in which the gospel was embedded, which has made it difficult for other cultures to accept. And in paper 149, and I had forgotten this until I came across it again, the Midwayers make a really extraordinary statement. In section 2, they say, Jesus understood the minds of men. He knew what was in the heart of man, and had his teachings been left as he presented them, the only commentary being the inspired interpretation afforded by his earth life, all nations and all religions of the world would speedily have embraced the gospel of the kingdom. The well-meant efforts of Jesus's early followers to restate his teachings so as to make them the more acceptable to certain nations, races, and religions only resulted in making such teachings the less acceptable to all other nations, races, and religions. So if we are to believe the Midwayers, and I'm inclined to, all nations and all religions of the world would have speedily accepted or speedily embraced his gospel, except for the misguided actions of his early followers. By adding things to his original gospel and modifying it in that way, they diminished its apparent universal spiritual appeal. At least that's the implication and what that statement is saying. So this raises inevitably to me the question, in this day and age, would all religions speedily embrace the gospel as it was originally taught by Jesus? And I'm not going to answer my own question.
Well, thank you, George. I think if you are charitable, you will not require me to answer it either. But I do believe that you've raised important questions that deserve to be considered. In part, your remarks bring to mind the comparison between what the Apostle Paul did with the techniques and approaches of Abner operating in a more Eastern realm, wherein, to my recollection, the Midwayers praised the constancy and coherence of Abner, but on the other hand, they praised the savvy and the political understanding and organizational ability of Paul. And so I think these two elements, or perhaps these two collections of elements, are pretty close to the center of your question. I wonder, Marvin, if you could take a look at that idea, or at least give us your impressions of the aspects of the paragraphs that I sought to heighten or emphasize.
I'll try and draw together some strands here between what George is bringing up and the paragraph that you're asking us to wrestle with. And then there's the additional question of, well, what do we do at our current time in relation to these dilemmas? First of all, George, I want to thank you. That passage has been for me a very significant passage in terms of procedure and in terms of understanding our current dilemma situation vis-a-vis Christianity. And I think it has implications for our current situation with what we do with the fifth epical revelation. And I'll try and say a little bit about each of those. When I ask myself, what were, they describe Paul making shrewd theological trades in order to further his purposes. But I think the paragraph you read is in reference to those trades. They were short-term, highly beneficial for the rapid spread of Christianity, and long-term placed a ceiling on the universal acceptance of Jesus' true teachings. And when I think about what those trade-offs were, there were, I think of 2 or 3 key compromises that fall in this category. One, I think, occurred before Paul even came on the scene, which happened at the time of the resurrection. And these are things that happen because in human nature, unconsciously, they're powerful emotionally. I think sometimes that's what goes on here. And they're inadvertent. They're not well thought out. They're gone with in the moment because they have power emotionally. And in the instance of Jesus having been crucified and the tremendous tragedy and public tragedy of that situation, and then 3 days later, his beginning to appear and resurrect in resurrection appearances, and the flood of emotion, of joy and relief, and the opposite of the profound grief that marked his crucifixion. The apostles, and Peter in particular, but all of them, Peter being the spokesman, were enveloped in this very, very powerful mix of emotions. And they found, as the book describes it, that the story of focused on Jesus' person and his resurrection had, quote, great power with the people. And so they ran with it. And that's the first of the major errors, I think, that were made that are exemplary of the paragraph you shared with us, George. It's a dual error. It's an unfortunate emphasis on the person of Jesus as salvational, because that's not what Jesus taught. Jesus didn't say, if you believe in me, you will be saved. What he said is, if you believe in the Father and your relationship with God, as I do, as I show you this way, you will be saved. So they made that error. It was belief in the sacred nature of the Christ that gained salvation, and that salvation played an undue influence in the gospel as it was reconfigured, right? Survival after death became, and by believing in Jesus, became the central truth of the gospel, rather than living family relationship with God and with each other, the gospel that Jesus taught. So that was the initial error. The second error, and Paul came along and appended it to the first error, was the sacrificial atonement doctrine. And it's a grievous error. And I want to share, I actually pulled up this passage that I want to share with you all that's sort of exemplary of it. Oh, I think I just lost it. Oh, hold on just a sec. I got it. Yeah, the barbarous, you'll like this, Neil, the barbarous idea of appeasing an angry God, of propitiating an offending Lord, of winning the favor of deity through sacrifices and penance, and even by the shedding of blood, represents a religion wholly puerile and primitive, a philosophy unworthy of an enlightened age of science and truth. Such beliefs are utterly repulsive to the celestial beings and the divine rulers who serve and reign in the universes. It is an affront to God to believe, hold, or teach that innocent blood must be shed in order to win his favor or to divert the fictitious divine wrath. And that is 454, paper 4, section 5, paragraph 4. And so Paul came along, and it was a trade. I mean, he appealed to the sacrificial nature of the Jewish culture, and of many of the mystery cults of that time were very much into sacrificial theology. And so he added that in so that early Christianity could spread, and he probably believed it as well. I think he was sincere, and it was a huge error. And that combination of elements represents the impediment for the more universal acceptance of Jesus' actual teaching. And it's embedded at the core of Christian teaching. There are sometimes elaborate ways of trying to understand and interpret it that are more liberal and less objectionable, but it remains a key impediment. So the issue I think we have to deal with is, as you know, our revelation makes such an overt statement about the error and the horrible nature of that error. It's an attack on the nature of God, really, trivialization of God's nature. So the question is, what do we do with that? You know, do we highlight that in our relationship with Christianity, and in our evolutionary efforts? I'm kind of the opinion, as in looking at how Jesus proceeded, he didn't really attack the nature of the errors in people's religious beliefs. I think the approach he took, and I think it's a wise one even for us as a movement, is to emphasize the true reality, the higher realities, and run with it, and move strongly, assertively, with the truth of God's loving nature, and that sacrifice is not necessary, but not to attack it as highly objectionable. I think that would be a mistake. Sorry, I wasn't as clear as I'd like to be, but
I think you were very persuasive, Marvin. I believe that perhaps you may be modest about your own abilities to analyze the situation. Just for your information, you happen to have cited, probably not by accident, one of the passages that our colleague Bob is very frequently inclined to refer to. And I think that this is not because you and Bob particularly think alike, but because this is a crucial thought that the divine counselor is putting forward at a rather early stage of the Urantia book, which indeed does reveal a very deep flaw in Christian theology and the Christian religion. So the questions that you concluded with are quite relevant, and I'm not sure that I have an answer that will immediately flow off the top of my head. Perhaps Andre can fill that bill and reply to your question, and maybe George's.
What specifically would you like me to reply to?
Well, let's see. Marvin was basically asking whether we need to emphasize how much we reject the atonement doctrine, and what we should say about that, either to people with a Christian background or
Yes,
people who
yes.
have another background.
In circling back to the idea that George had first, put forward, which was that we, because we've deviated, now we're more acceptable to the Western world, but less acceptable to everybody else. Well, the question would be, there's almost an implication that in going back to Jesus' message, in some way we might become less acceptable to the Western world, in the sense that it was only going to move slowly in that regard. It was going to grow organically, but it was going to move slower, and hence they made it more appealing somehow. And we can't also make it more appealing to the Eastern world by picking some concepts there that might also appeal to them. So I like the idea of going back to that kind of idea that this is not about salvation. It's simply about the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, or the parenthood of God and the siblinghood of man, if we need to couch it that way. But that could also be another rabbit hole, couldn't it? If at some point that's much too generic. It's in trying to appease women these days. Are we making it less appealing to men, or to people that would prefer that things be clearer, or God knows what? I think the idea is that we have to become comfortable with the idea that the gospel right now has to be restated in such a way, and maybe in each generation, that it really does focus on the nature of God, that it and the nature of our relationship with God in such a way that its appeal may only bring along small numbers of people at one time, but eventually may reach a critical mass whereby community has developed and evolved around those scattered members that start to believe this way, and eventually has an effect on the remainder of humanity, that it becomes an appealing not only philosophy, but an appealing living philosophy to those that would be adherents or potential adherents, and may evolve from there. But who can pretend to know how this might evolve? I don't see why people don't see this now, except that people don't universally have an interest now. There is a large, at least in the first world, a preponderant number of people that are satisfied with their human condition as it is, whether they believe in a current religion, or whether they are agnostic or atheistic. And it seems that where, for instance, the Urantia revelation is actually growing, not by leaps and bounds by any stretch, but where it's actually taking root, is in the third world, where there is some potential for dissatisfaction with life and a hunger for something more.
Thank you, Andre. I would congratulate you on combining the ideas that several others have expressed. And you rattled off the expression fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man, but I think very commendably refrain from creating the acronym fog bomb and then declare that fog bomb is the answer. So I
Well,
certainly
it once
would.
was.
I will certainly refrain from suggesting that, but I do believe that the idea of simplification has merit on the one hand, but it also has a disadvantage of lesser levels of profundity, lesser levels of sophistication. You have said that perhaps residents of the first world in which we are situated are losing interest in these matters, but I'm not sure that making things so simple that they might appeal to someone in grammar school is the answer to that problem. I really don't know. Bob, I turn to you again as the end of this discussion, and I must apologize for putting you once again in the cleanup position. I did give you a commercial when Marvin came out with that quotation, because I know that these remarks of the divine counselor are very dear to your own heart, I think for good reason. But I wonder whether you could perhaps grab onto the issue of balance in terms of our approach and activities. In effect, Andre has asked whether if we change the message, we will actually lose interest and support in the first world, in Western civilization. I think that's a very reasonable question, but I would give you a development of it. If the effort to return to the true teachings of Jesus as he intended them is indeed our message, is indeed our effort, will we antagonize the leaders of the authoritarian tendencies in organized institutional Christianity? And will, in effect, we create an antagonism that undermines our own efforts?
A great question and a great discussion. We kind of nibble around the edges of this East and West, Occident and Orient, a little bit, at least in the last 3 or 4 webinars. Marvin brought up the idea of, we shouldn't be attacking, and I totally agree with that. I may have brought this up before, so at the sake of reinforcing something that the Midwayers tell us about how Jesus operated. When he went to Rome and he met with the Mithraics, the Cynics, the Stoics, etc. There were 36 of them, apparently. Just one sentence really stands out to me, if I could read it. It's from 132. It's in the introduction of it's 04. Never once did he attack their errors or even mention the flaws in their teachings. In each case, he would select the truth in what they taught and then proceed so to embellish and illuminate this truth in their minds that in a very short time, this enhancement of the truth effectively crowded out the associated error. I think that the Urantia movement in the 50, 60 plus years, I guess, I suppose, because of the extent of the cosmology that goes from end to end, that cosmology is necessary to, I think, to be able to put the teachings in perspective for what the revelators are really trying to tell us. So is it balance? And this George's question about if we just took the basic kernel of what the gospel is and go into the West, into the East, and try to portray it back to the West, there can't be a similar approach. I think the approach is what exactly Jesus did with all of these interesting thinkers. The Mithraics were, a mystery religion and essentially pagan, but yet there was some truth in their thinking, as we do know today. So George's question, and Neil, I think you brought this up, or maybe it was Marvin. The spirit of truth operates in the currency that it is to be able to help us understand truth in the vernacular and in the concept that it is today. So we've got that working with us, and that's only new for a couple thousand years, on this planet, a very short snap of the finger. So how does I've always felt that the Urantia movement, and I've been faced with saying things that I shouldn't have said, certainly even the atonement. The divine counselor says, what a travesty against the infinite character of God. That's that last sentence in the paragraph that Marvin brought up. This teaching that is, in all his austere coldness and hardness, his tender mercies were never forthcoming until he saw his only begotten son, that's not quite the words, bleeding on the cross of Calvary. Now, I botched that a little bit, but it's the, I'm sorry, on the cross. They hit that pretty hard, but with that, trying to portray that is almost an attack, because it's an attack on a belief, on a concept, on a theology, and it's the way that individuals operate in the Western side of the house. So there will be, and I think the global endeavor, Neil, is you have always portrayed it, is that regional groups are going to have to operate in ways that are functional, that will be able to operate in their own locality. Now, what are those? That has to happen, and that's probably why we've said early on in the first webinar, we said, well, what's the extent of this fifth epochal revelation? Well, probably another millennia for sure, because the errors have to be crowded out, but you do that with very small truths, never attacking the other truths. I'm not sure if I ever got to George to the answer, George, that you decided not to answer yourself of your own question, but I think that this idea of East and West, the Brahmin idea, is certainly going to be something that that parts 1, 2, and 3 of the papers are going to have to support. Um, how do we get the idea of the supreme being? This whole idea of Havona. I mean, these are things that are not going to happen within the next 100 years. But the truth of how the thought adjuster creates our soul from our thoughts is where salvation, this whole salvation idea, Marvin, that you brought up is one of the 2 errors, salvation and atonement. I would totally agree. But the cosmic perspective about how the soul is developed and where the thought adjuster fits into that, and how the thought adjuster is the father abroad in the entire universe. It's a personal universe. So that's a smorgasbord of everything that I think we've talked about here, and hope it made a little bit of sense. Over to you, Neil.
Well, you always do, Bob. I think the underlying problem that all of us face is that the answers to this question or these questions are far from intuitive. They have to do with wisdom. They have to do with experience. They have to do with receptivity and personal interest as well as cultural interest. I would like to go back to George because, in effect, his question has generated quite a bit of exchange of views. And in turning back to George, I would like to say that the thesis or the thought that I'm going to put to him is derived from a colleague who is not with us today, but he is with us nevertheless. And this is, of course, our colleague, Stephen. And his thesis, perhaps 2 webinars ago, was that the essential technique is dialogue, not advancing particular theses or contentions, but an effort to communicate, to share, and perhaps to ask what others need. We have this huge repository of wisdom. What in it appeals to you? So I offer this to you as the technique of dialogue. I'm paraphrasing comments that Stephen put forward previously, but at least for the sake of postulating a possible approach that may have merit. What do you think, George?
Approach to what? Are you talking about, I mean, what specifically are we talking? Are we talking about creating interest in the Urantia book, spreading the gospel, developing the global endeavor? What are we talking about?
Well, I would say that Bob's comments about the global endeavor were not on the agenda of this gathering. They are of interest to him and interest to me, but I'm talking for the sake of our discussion, essentially about what you asked before, the questions of how we go forward in seeking to promote interest in the true teachings of Jesus in the context of the world at large, what we do and the approach that we undertake, perhaps as a distinction to the organized Christian approach that has existed so far, perhaps in harmony with it, or what do we do? And now what I've asked you is whether going at these tactical questions by virtue of a technique of dialogue may be a productive approach.
Well, as opposed to technique, my question really addressed what the Midwayers said, which was the whole world would have accepted the gospel of Jesus if his apostles had just presented it. I mean, that's an extraordinary statement to me. I can't, I've read it multiple times. For some reason, this time it just hit me like a sledgehammer right between the eyes. Just think about that statement. We could be living in a world now where everyone was following the gospel of Jesus, at least to a larger extent than we are. If only the apostles hadn't tried to improve what Jesus taught, hadn't adapted it, hadn't modified it, hadn't adulterated it. If they had just trusted that he knew what he was doing, if they had just trusted that he understood the minds of men, that he understood the hearts of men, if they just taken his gospel and spread it without adding their own baggage to it, that's, to me, that's an extraordinary statement. So my question wasn't what technique do we use? My question really goes back to the whole effort that we've been engaged in for weeks and months, which is that we're trying to find the original teachings of Jesus. We're trying to separate that from everything else that has been added to it by the apostles and everyone who followed them. And and this statement just sums it all up. If we could find that, if we could identify that, then we would have something that might possibly have a universal spiritual appeal. At least that's what I draw from that statement made by the Midwayers. Back to you.
Thank you, George. You've given a very persuasive interpretation of the situation. I believe that in your earlier remarks, you commented on the implications about what would have happened, the counterfactual conclusion that the revelators reached. But then you said, does this imply that the technique will work now? And I think we do not have an answer to that question.
I didn't address the technique. I addressed the message.
I'm fine.
I'm not talking about technique. I'm not talking about how you, I'm just talking, what is the message? If people would just stop corrupting the message, it would get out.
Okay, I accept your refinement of what I was trying to express. I think when I used the word technique, I really did mean message. And so I believe we're talking about the same thing. But what we are not able to allege, we are not able to assert, is that the premise of the Revelators' comment about what would have happened is a prediction of what could happen now. I mean, we don't really know that. Now,
I'd like to
Yes, go ahead.
respond. I'd like to
Go
respond
ahead,
to
please. I was just on the verge of calling on you.
Okay. I'd like to share a passage with you all, and then carry forward with the conversation. And it's related to these errors were made. We are currently in our situation. What can we do to remedy the situation? Which is, I believe, the kind of question you're asking,
Yes.
Neil.
Yes.
And here's this paragraph. This is 178, 115, and it's very related to what the paragraph that George initially shared, because to me it's the remedy, it's the recipe as for remedy of that unfortunate misdirection. So the passage reads 178, 115. This gospel of the kingdom is a living truth. I have told you it is like the leaven in the dough, like the grain of mustard seed. And now I declare that it is like the seed of the living being, which from generation to generation, while it remains the same living seed, unfailingly unfolds itself in new manifestations and grows acceptably in channels of new adaptation to the peculiar needs and conditions of each successive generation. The revelation I have made to you is a living revelation, and I desire that it shall bear appropriate fruits in each individual and in each generation, in accordance with the laws of spiritual growth, increase, and adaptive development. From generation to generation, this gospel must show increasing vitality and exhibit greater depth of spiritual power. So we can't go back and unmake the mistakes of the early Christian leaders. We sit with our own challenges. And I actually think that we're wandering on the cusp of a parallel error, to be frank with you, to what was in our movement, to what was going on in the early Christian era. And, the book describes that error as transforming the religion of Jesus into the religion about Jesus, which was arguably in many ways what Christianity has become. And why did that happen? And how is it related to the possibility that we could do something parallel? What the revelators tell us is that the evolution of evolutionary religious structures happens often unconsciously. and driven by emotion, right? So the question we have to ask ourselves of the last 70 years of our history is, what is easy and natural for us to do? Because that's exactly what we've been doing. What we've been
Sorry,
doing,
Marvin, let me probe your statement just now.
I'm going to
Are you-
unpack it.
All right, but when you unpack it, I want you to interpret your question as favoring what is easy or natural, or alternatively as favoring what is more difficult and more challenging.
Yeah, definitely the second. So what is easy and natural for us, and it's what we've been doing, is to focus on the religion about the Urantia book versus the religion of the Urantia book. To make it our mission to spread a text and to turn people onto the book as our primary mission. That is the religion about the Urantia book. There's this amazing fifth epical revelation, and you have to read it. That's not the gospel. That's the religion about the Urantia book, and it's not the religion of the Urantia book. It's parallel to the error that the early Christian leaders made, which was very easy and very natural for them to focus on the person of Jesus, right? The revelatory individual or the revelatory text as the big news, right? The real challenge, as it was then and as it is now, is encapsulated in the paragraph I just read, which is to take the heart of the gospel and reconfigure it, restate it in a way that reaches the culture of our day and age powerfully and evocatively, and responds to the needs of our generation spiritually. That is far more difficult than turning people onto a book. It's far more challenging. And so we shy away from it because it's scary. And yet it is what the revelation itself over and over and over is mandating we must attempt, right? So we've made a good effort at spreading the book, which is a good and proper thing to do. But it's, in my mind, stage one to a much larger endeavor, which is then, when we're devoted students of this revelation, understanding the core elements of the gospel, being creative evolutionarily and culturally in evolving new models of reaching out to all of humanity with that gospel in a way that speaks to the needs of our generation and our global or emerging global culture. And then going back to George's initial statement, I think the message of Christianity has, in some senses, lost efficacy in the first world as well. I mean, the world is struggling for a new vision of what the gospel was and is. And that is our challenge. And it's a difficult challenge. It's not an easy challenge to evolve a sense of the gospel and the culture that embodies it, that is evocative, that can uplift human culture. So I hope I'm addressing both George's initial paragraph, your questions, Neil. I don't think we should be busy refuting Christianity. I think we should be busy developing the alternative that is current for our generation, that Jesus asked his apostles to develop, and that is asking us to develop now in the present day, and promote it aggressively, assertively, and let the error fall away. And yes, I think we will encounter opposition if we run with that true and original gospel, and bring it on. That's historically inevitable.
Yeah, Marvin, you have implicitly anticipated the focus that I was going to address in my question to Andre coming up. And this question pertains to, shall we say, the emotional and psychological overtones of harmony, as opposed to a certain amount of discontent or diversity that may engender opposition or disquiet. I think the comparison I would offer is the fairly colloquial traditional statement that you cannot make an omelet without breaking eggs. So what is the goal here? Is it to break the eggs or to create the omelet? And what is the price of creating the omelet? Should we be aggressively breaking the eggs, Or should we hope that someone else will break the eggs and mix the omelet for us? Andre, I give you these options.
Well, first of all,
Oh, Master Chef.
I thank you for the question because I love omelets, and we can start there. It's a good question in the sense that I'm not sure how apt the metaphor is necessarily, but we are in a big conundrum in terms of how we see the problem that's before us, in terms of how we spread the message of Jesus, and how we spread the revelation. And if we study the revelation, we have a lot of different alternative and competing narratives that are there to try to instruct us as to both problems to avoid and solutions to pursue. And let me just start with looking at it revelation by revelation, or at least the first two revelations to start out with. One, we saw that rebellion in the first revelation constituted trying to do something in a non-evolutionary way, trying to upstep too quickly the cultural stream, giving people what they were not ready for before they were evolutionarily ready for it, namely whatever it is that they tried to accelerate progress with, that speedily failed because primitive human beings were not capable of assimilating it. We have plenty of examples in culture today where culture is at very different levels intellectually. They're also at very different levels spiritually in different cultures. And while we may not be as competent in being able to determine that, we can certainly on a one-to-one basis determine when somebody is at least open to a message, if not ready for a message. And again, this harkens back to the idea of how satisfied are people on the one hand, and how ready are they, how much do they see it as in their interest to be pursuing what I or a group of human beings calls the pursuit of truth. And this opens up a whole can of worms, what is truth, right? And if we're studying the teachings correctly, we begin to understand that it's a living phenomenon, and that it's something that its beliefs have not approached the level of faith if we're not living them, and we're not living the truth. Well, we're not pursuing truth unless we're striving to live it in some way. How do you make that attractive to people if they're not hungering for it in the first place? So there's that. There's the idea of Adam and Eve having pursued wanting again to speed things up in a certain way, but also having short-circuited things. The back end takeaway was they were not willing to wait for a critical mass of their progeny to be available to be a self-sustaining phenomenon over time that would have been able to then pursue the biologic uplift that was part of the plan, and the cultural uplift as well that went along with it over a long period of time. Instead, it was something that was destined to peter out because it was a subcritical mass. And we're in that same position today. We keep talking about our movement as though it's been here for hundreds of years. We keep saying, we ought to know better. Well, we ought to, in a certain sense, know better. But we are scattered hither and yon. We are a very thin movement. And we need a critical mass to evolve. And somehow we haven't been pursuing just the normal track of propagating our fellowship. We don't even have a biologic propagation of our fellowship, where from generation to generation, it's being perpetuated in families. So that's an element that we need to look at, I think. And then we could learn perhaps from, what Melchizedek did and what Jesus did, but I'm not going to go on and on with that because our time is limited. But I think we can see that we have things to learn in terms of how we propagate this. One ray of hope is that there are numerous micro movements within our movement that are starting to see that we do need to help create competent teachers and leaders that can both teach the Urantia teachings, but equally and maybe more importantly, teach the gospel and be able to propagate that belief and on the current stage that we find ourselves. And I'll only state one last thing. I was just impressed a few weeks ago in the Philippines with how the Urantia book and the teachings are propagating in families, because there is a strong family culture. There is an organic kind of effort to teach the teachings there, and all domains are in alignment in a certain sense. It's not growing, in the thousands, but it's growing over 20 years, so that there's 60 to 100 people that are solid readers, and it's multi-generational. There's a lot of hope there, and we can learn from that.
Well, thank you, Andre. Like your colleagues, you have given me different strands, and I think by saying that there are different strands, I am not criticizing. I'm really identifying the fact that all of us are grappling with issues that are very difficult and delicate. Now, in your case, you started off by declaring that you're fond of omelets, but later in your remarks, you showed more interest in worms than in eggs. So I'm not sure what I should take from that. I had a friend who once declared to me that bad dietary practices were actually the cause of the Protestant Reformation. He said it was the diet of worms. So anyway, I will now turn to Bob and ask him whether he might be ready to read for us formal question B at the bottom of page 6, or if he prefers to start with observations inspired by some of these recent remarks, I would leave him that option.
No, I'll start to read. There's a lot to think about. George, appreciate you throwing out that question. It obviously segued off of what the agenda is here today, and appropriately so. I take heed of the idea of technique versus message, and I'm taking that. I'm going to reflect on that a little bit more. So Neil, I'll do the reading now. I'm sorry. Where did you want me to go?
The big question at the bottom, formal question B.
Okay, great. I have it right here. In section 2 of paper 99, and Melchizedek declares, quote, "Only the real religion of personal spiritual experience can function helpfully and creatively in the present crisis of civilization." And that's from 99, section 2, paragraph 1. As we endeavor to embody, encourage, and advocate the religion of personal spiritual experience, and simultaneously seek to stimulate active interest in the teachings of the Urantia book, how should we avoid, or at least diminish, the possible impression that our efforts are actually intended to promote the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity? Would it be wise for committed readers of the Urantia book to make emphatic statements disavowing these motives, and then repeat such assurances every so often? What would be the advantages and disadvantages of doing
Well, now, just to reward you for your eloquent reading, I wonder if you might like to try the first reply.
Sure. We've talked a little bit about this, taking the last two questions. Would it be wise for the committed readers of the Urantia book to make emphatic statements disavowing these motives and then repeat such assurances every so often? I think even to broach that at this point, with what I've said, and I picked up on what Marvin said, of course, when I was talking about providing as much truth as you can, never never attacking, but highlighting truth. So if we take that approach, then it's not necessary to do what's in the premise of that question. What's important is to listen, to understand what the truth really might be based upon the cosmology that a long-term reader and even a short-term reader in certain cases should be able to. Going back to this idea of teachers and leaders, what should the teachers and leaders really know? That's a really good question, I think, because how would you discern the truth in what an individual is saying in the cacophony of religious thought and theology that we have around the planet here today? One quick thought about what Andre, you just said that I tracked it this way. You said that there's different velocities of how each part of the planet may be thinking about their theology or their religion, depending on which area that we're talking about. And I got thinking about Alvin Toffler's idea of the first, second, and third waves. And I remember there was an article that he put out in the New York Times about 10 years ago, and they showed the planet as a transistor. And there were different speeds and elements because some parts of our society function differently in commerce and politics and whatever. So we've got that overlay going on at the same time as we have this ball of twine, so to speak, of religious thought, theologic thought. And then to add to that, the difference between the idea that the West is individually driven, personality, the ideas of a personality would hit there quickly, the truth of personality, as the Urantia papers teach it, versus the East, where the truth of the supreme being would be, and energy would be much easier to approach. So those sorts of truths for teachers and leaders, I think, are important to be able to, and then listen, of course, to understand what those truths might be, and then figure out how to embellish them. So on that second question, Neil, I'd say that there's more disadvantages. On the third question, there's more disadvantages to the premise in the second question. And the first question was, I think we've talked a lot about that in different techniques. So I'll leave that one and send it back to you.
If I understand your most recent comments, what you're basically saying, I think, is that we do not have to address the differences, simply operate a different program, and that will express our intention better than explicitly taking issue with the tenets and practices of Christianity. Am I correct in interpreting what you've just said?
I think so. Let me just redo it one more time. The approach Jesus took with the 36 Stoic cynics, Mithraic folks, was that he embellished their truth, which would crowd out. And this is an amazing psychological. Marvin can talk about whether that's a good approach or not. Jesus used it as an approach, so that the later teachers and messengers were then able to impart whatever they were going to impart. The truth then crowded out the error. So what I'm saying, Neil, is that the truth of, truth, I'm just going to leave it at that, needs to crowd out error. And it's up to those individuals who have the knowledge, the presence, done this, to be able to understand how to do that, how to listen well.
Thank you. I will call on you, Marvin, in just a minute, but I'd like to go to George first. The question you asked before, George, and you corrected me, is not a question of technique, but a question of message. And I told you at the time that I thought the two were essentially the same. Maybe they are, maybe they are slightly different. But in any case, let's go with your thought of message. Now, in a previous comment, Bob has emphasized the cosmological and philosophic dimensions of the revelation as perhaps an attraction point that may appeal to some groups. Do we have a situation of differentiating the content that we use as our message depending on the characteristics of the listener? In differentiating the message, do we have to declare that this is not Christianity, or should we simply leave that implicit?
I wouldn't even address it. I think for the very good reasons brought up by Bob and others, it's all you're doing is attacking their beliefs. And when you attack somebody's belief, they get defensive and they're not very receptive. So I wouldn't address what's wrong in their religion. I would address what's right. And as to the other part of your question, I think Jesus, let me just read something that Jesus advised his apostles to do. This is after he had a little discussion with Simon, who tried to convert a Persian to the gospel by telling him, by the way, you really shouldn't worship fire. And that didn't go over too well, but Jesus straightened it out. And so, but the point was, he took Simon aside and he said basically what Bob said and what Marvin said. Don't try to take something out of their belief, try to put something into it. And so Simon said, well, what do you really mean? So it sounds like the first thing that Jesus recommends as an approach for people who are looking for God is what he says, where is it, 141. He advises the apostles, simply go forth proclaiming, this is the kingdom of heaven. God is your father and you are his sons. And this good news, if you wholeheartedly believe it, is your eternal salvation. So that sounds to me like a simple spiritual appeal.
Thank you. Marvin, you asked for the floor before I called on George, and so I will refrain from giving you, Marvin, a particular program since you obviously have one in mind yourself.
Thank you, Neil. I appreciate that. This is a great conversation. And the thought I have is sort of to connect strands of the conversation. I think I'll start with what Andre said. We're at a stage, interestingly enough, where more and more attention is being paid to preparing teachers and leaders, folks to go forward. Let's call it in ministry, some kind of effort at outreach, to take the imperatives of the revelation as related to spiritual uplift and move forward with it. And it's going on in multiple locations in multiple ways. And one of the things that folks who are going to try to function in that role need to be able to do is to respond intelligently to the challenge you're describing, Neil, which is what do we do in relation to Christianity and to the errors in Christianity and to Christianity as the dominant religion in our cultural situation where we encountered it anyways. And so for me, I think there's a way to move forward that to me is elegant. And that is, if you look at the heart of the gospel, the vision of the gospel, and how it responds to the peculiar needs of our generation, our world is shrinking. Our cultures are coming more and more into collision with each other. More and more people are interacting as if we participate in a unified global culture. And indeed, that is what is emerging here, is what the revelation tells us. We're at this peculiar stage where we're moving from nationalisms to a global culture, right? Which is fraught with difficulties and challenges and antagonisms as it's attempting to unfold, to be born. That characterizes the peculiar set of needs of our world in our generation and in the generations immediately to come. So what does the gospel have to respond with to that set of challenges? It has exactly what's needed. You know, in the overall symbolism of Jesus' original gospel, which is that we are part of a universal, not only a global spiritual family, but a universal spiritual family beyond this world. There is the core, the kernel of the vision that needs to be communicated to our emerging global culture. And so the message to Christianity, as it is to every other religion, is what Jesus was actually speaking to us about is about a phenomenon that is much larger than Christianity, much larger than Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or the unchurched or the nuns or those who are struggling spiritual but not religious. It encompasses every human being who is searching for relevance and relation to the larger reality that are divine realities within religious institutions, within Christianity, outside of Christianity. The gospel of Jesus and the vision of Jesus is larger than Christianity as an institution. It's a trans-institutional reality. It's an overarching set of relationships that we have with each other that sits above and subsumes all of these smaller institutional affiliations we have, including the major world religious traditions. And the nascent interfaith movement has that understanding implicit in it, that there's something larger that we're all part of. And that's the heart of this gospel that we need to move forward with, I believe, that flows from this revelation. And it's the original gospel of Jesus, that there's a larger spiritual family we're part of, a larger reality we're part of, that these smaller loyalties and affiliations are within. So if we move forward aggressively and we train teachers and leaders in these spiritual perspectives and to be articulated in expressing them, you know, diplomatically to Christians and practitioners of every other religious stripe, will be successful in being what Jesus was, which was gracious to all people, regardless of their background, and showing them a higher and larger vision, a higher and larger set of possibilities that doesn't negate their particular tradition, but includes it and warmly welcomes it into the interfaith family of all religious believers. So we need to train our teachers and leaders to be able to understand and hold that reality and communicate it effectively to the broader culture. And that's this new and upstepped gospel that they're speaking of in that paragraph, you know, that we need to work to evolve, that will speak to the needs of our current moment, you know, culturally and globally.
Thank you, Marvin. Andre, I'm going to try to give a slightly different twist to our discussion by actually dipping back into the earlier moments today when we talked about the tension between Greek philosophy and Roman authoritarianism, or the premise of uniformity. Now, the strand that I'm going to offer to you has to do with the relationship between ideas or theories, if you prefer, and insisting upon acceptance. In other words, the Christian tradition has been predicated, at least in part, on evangelization on behalf of certain doctrines or creeds or practices.
Mhm.
Is this a tradition that we need to set aside? In other words, we are not promoting uniformity. We are not promoting acceptance of particular theories or doctrines. We are promoting instead acceptance psychologically, emotionally, spiritually of the relationship with God and the relationship with our brothers and sisters who may have different views entirely.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you make a good point there. I think, first of all, let's consider what it might actually look like were we promulgating doctrines. Take that as a null a null hypothesis here. So we're that our standpoint. The question is, how effective is that in promulgating the message that is the gospel of Jesus? The gospel of Jesus is trying to convey not a doctrine. It is not a doctrine to consider that God is our Father and all men and women are brothers and sisters as a result. It is a way of life and an attitude that can only be acquired, I think, by somehow internalizing that message and adapting it to one's own life. In order to do that, question is, what is the vehicle that is best for getting across that message? And it seems to me that one of the answers, at least, is in a relational approach, in one, getting to know that person, therefore, in a formal way, listening to them. But in an informal way, it's getting to know people. It's getting to understand who they are. It's making friends with people. And when we think about the people with whom we may have had an impact over some period of time, the greatest impacts that we've probably had with people have been those that we've had greater lengths of time where there's, excuse me, more of an evolution of our relationship that with that relationship came some of the truths of the revelation that we've been able to promulgate. And so that whether people have been full-blown one to the revelation or to the gospel, they are at least friendly to it in some way, and they've come to some kind of understanding as a result of getting to know the person who's been purveying the message. And the message that's been purveyed has been less important than the relationship that they've had with that person. Because especially in our world, I don't know that we can measure success in terms of numbers of souls converted in the same way that people might have looked at that in an evangelistic way at some time in the past. I think we have to look at to what extent is the world transforming one person at a time? Are people conducting themselves differently? At least in our small circles. Certainly the world, the way we see news cycles and whatnot, is going through enormous upheavals right now on the one hand, but what gets missed is the quiet kind of evolution in the background that may be occurring as a result of person-to-person contact. And I think that's one of the more important things. There's one other point I'd like to make, and that is in what everyone was talking about, I would underscore that completely. That the approach of not taking away, of simply underscoring the truths and promulgating the gospel and the teachings of the Urantia book that way, that is all sound. The thing that I think gets missed in all of this is the one place where we ought to be trying to transform things is ourselves. How do I look for the beam in my own eye first before I look to take the mote out of my brother's eye? And that's the real issue. If I'm focused on how I'm allowing God into my life to help transform me, I am much less prone, for one thing, in looking at the mote in my brother or sister's eye to try to pick it out. But secondly, I become more effective as I grow to be able to promulgate the message that we're trying to get across, whether it be the gospel and in terms of that focus, or whether it be the revelation as a whole over time.
Thank you. I would congratulate you along with all the others for asking a series of profound questions to which there are no easy answers. But the the premise that there are no easy answers is the focus that I'd like to address to George. In effect, we are in a situation of, shall we say, discontinuity in relation to the history of humanity up to now. It is clear that if the revelators had been content with the progression of the world as it stood, if they had been content with the reality of Christianity as it stood, they did not need to bother to write the Urantia book. So the fact that they provided the fifth epical revelation, I believe, is at least a convincing argument that there were concerns of theirs, there were concerns within the spiritual hierarchy, that something had to change. And so now here is the focus of the question I'd like to put to you, George. Is the conviction that something has to change an essential part of the message, of the technique, in the words that I used? In other words, can we achieve any results among people who are not convinced that there is anything that needs to change? And is the effort to bring them to the understanding that something needs to change intrinsically a part of our communication?
That's a very difficult question. As I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, well, you've got the human race, who can be divided up into those who listen to their adjusters and those who don't. So for those who listen to their adjusters, I don't know, it's hard to find a way to proceed with the question.
Well, let me simplify it for you. If you
I think I have a way. I'm gonna trace back to Andre, to what he said. The message, the technique, what needs to change? That was your question. Do we really need to change something? And I think yes, we really do. And it's my feeling, after studying the book for a few years, that this was an emergency action on a par with what Melchizedek had to do, because I think we're faced with a possible extinction of the spiritual light on this planet. If that sounds extreme, so be it. But in my mind, that is why it's absolutely, it's imperative that we do something different. And what we have to do different is what Andre brought up, which is we have to actually start living with the spirit within us. Instead of running around trying to convince everybody else to read the Urantia book and, or to persuade people to join our religious group or this or that, we can't do anything until we start acting from the spirit. And we can't act from the spirit until we live with the spirit. And we can't live with the spirit until we pray to the Father. Charles, God bless him, was always bringing this up to people. Nobody likes to hear it, but prayer and worship are critical to spiritual development. And you can believe that or not. I tend to believe it. And so this is where the greatest deficit lies, in my opinion, is within us. The Midwayers make the comment that next to his declaration that God is spirit, the next most important thing he said, Jesus, was the kingdom of heaven is within you, referring to the thought adjuster. So until we start taking that seriously, really take it seriously, we're not going to make any substantial progress. Not that we're not making progress, but you brought up the issues. Something really needs to change. And if that's the question, my answer is what really needs to change is we really need to start living with the spirit.
Thank you, George. You certainly have focused on a very important element that I was indeed trying to reach. The other side of it that you have not addressed is one that I will hand off to Bob if I can, and that is, are we confined to reaching out to people who want to change, or is there something in the message that may persuade them that they need to change? In other words, is this process that we are engaged in inherently restricted to people who want to change? Or is there some way we can increase the population of those who accept that something has to change and that they need to be part of that transformation of humanity that indeed is at the core of the fifth epical revelation?
I would answer that with 4 words: fruits of the Spirit. What came to mind as we were talking about this to me, as I was reflecting on some of the conversation here, we're all at the stage where we've got friends, colleagues, family, associates who are going to the mansion worlds, or possibly at the next dispensation going to the mansion worlds. What normally happens when a person dies? Well, we have a ceremony, a funeral, etc. Even someone who commits suicide. But what's talked about that individual, even an individual who commits suicide, we talk about those fruits of the Spirit that person provided to me, if I'm going to speak about that individual. We never talk about the problems. So it's a personal value universe where the fruits of the Spirit are those sorts of things that have to be lived, as George is saying, as Andre poked us with the fact that we have to change ourselves. So as I've been attending funerals, I've been thinking about that, and maybe taking some risk. And the last one I went to, just to kind of explain what was kind of running through my mind about all this in the last year or so, to kind of use language that goes outside of the norm. I attended a very parochial, provincial funeral. Matter of fact, the son of the individual who passed was a pastor. When they asked to talk about the individual, I'm more than willing to do that if, in fact, I know the individual. And as Andre mentioned, or I think it was maybe Marvin, the more we know the individual, the more we can speak about those fruits of the Spirit, because that's what everybody wants to know. I'm using terms like, George was a cosmic individual, and let me explain, how I thought that, and then I just, basically talk about, what are those spiritual values that George exhibited in his life. And I think that, one by one, you pull those things out, and those sorts of extended language, I like to think of it myself, what is some of the language that might provoke a truth in someone to start to think about it as their spirit as their thought adjuster is screaming at them, trying to get them to listen. Back over.
Thank you. I will press you perhaps with some knowledge of your personal activities. You've just referred to funerals that you've attended. Before we launched our webinar today, you stated that you had very recently attended a birthday party for 5-year-olds. I assume that you were shepherding your grandson's interest and not your own. But looking at those two types of events, do you believe that the framework of a birthday party is more productive than the framework of a funeral, or the reverse?
I think they're equally the same. We have to find those areas that are that we have the, if we're constantly thinking about it, what are the truths that I could, in a little conversation with someone standing watching kids jump on trampolines, there's always an opportunity. And I just think that if we listen correctly, as I said earlier, we'll find those opportunities to be able to drop a dime, so to speak. I think they're equally both the same, Neil. Over.
All right. I would offer opportunities to anyone who wants to contribute additional thoughts. We have come to essentially a reasonable point in this discussion. I think Marvin is next in line.
In response to your question about what if someone wants to change versus doesn't want to change? Well, first of all, in response to your question, larger question about change, do things have to change? Absolutely, from my point of view, absolutely, and all the time. We live in the age of the supreme, right? If things get frozen where they are, whether for us as individuals or culturally or in the whole, we're in bad shape. We're constantly changing and hopefully making progress toward, universal light and life. So yes, change universal. We're in the midst of flux with a trajectory that's ever forward. As regards, how do we approach folks who don't want something versus want something with, let's say, sharing the gospel, for lack of a better purpose? I like the old adage with a little twist. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But you sure can make him thirsty. And sometimes you can't make them thirsty, but I think what you can do is awaken them to the possibility that they are indeed thirsty. And I think that's what Jesus was superbly artistic at. And I think if you're going to try and do ministry, you have to get better at it. And it's very related to what Andre was talking about, coming to really know and appreciate and love a human being. Because until you do that, and you're in real genuine relationship with them, you don't have really an understanding of where their thirst lies and how to awaken it. But we were talking in Cosmic Citizen this morning. I think I'd say every human being, whether they sense it or understand it or consciously recognize it or not, wants to be loved, wants to feel like someone cares about them and that they're important and that they matter. And large numbers of people walk through life bereft of that feeling. They don't feel that. And they're demoralized and in tremendous pain, and even suicidal. And so the question for me is, how do you awaken them to the possibility that what they're thirsty and hungry for, which is this experience of being important and valuable and loved, and sharing it, that they're thirsty for that, they're hungry for that. How do you awaken them to that? That to me is the initial approach in terms of change, because you're getting down to fundamental motivation. What does a person want? When you deal with what they really want, what they yearn for, you're in potent territory, for change. So to me, it's a matter of awakening thirst and helping people to realize what they're thirsty for. And then when you're in that part of the conversation, offering them the water of life, as best you understand it.
Thank you, Marvin. I would say that I am currently in the process of being motivated to change, in the sense of ending this discussion, because we've just about reached the end of time available for it. I would recognize George, if you wish to give us any concluding remarks that may appeal to you or may have occurred to you in listening to your other colleagues.
All of the comments have been really interesting, and I appreciate them all. I don't really think I have anything additional to add. It's been we've covered quite a bit of ground, and I think I really don't have anything to add. Everybody summed it up nicely.
Thank you very much. Bob, your turn for the same question. Do you have concluding remarks that you'd like to share with us?
I think I'd parrot what George just said. Great discussion, lots of food for thought. I'm going to play it back and reflect on some of these conversations. So thanks, everybody.
Well, you've now, excuse me, implicitly given me an entry point to talk about my task of writing the report. This is going to be quite a challenge, I will say. Andre, your turn for concluding remarks.
Only that I don't think we can underscore enough just how important it is for us to be following the inspiration of Jesus, striving to grow where we need to grow, striving to hone our message for each individual hearer, and to do our best. Lord knows every day presents to us where we are less than. It certainly does to me. And the next thing to remember, I think, is what our next opportunity is to serve as the Master served. If we can remember that, then the world gets incrementally better.
Thank you. I will take that as the last word. 2 webinars ago, Doreen Hain was the last speaker, and I joked that she had fulfilled the perception among men that women always want to have the last word. So I don't have an opportunity here to use that joke again, but it has been a great pleasure. I concur with all of you who have commented that we have had an extremely interesting discussion, very provocative. For the sake of our viewers, I would state we have now reached the end of this discussion on page 6 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. When we resume, presumably in January, although we have not picked a date, we will start with page 7, which begins another segment of the essay called The Presence of God. And I wish all of you a happy holiday season. I look forward to continuing our discussion in the new year. Thank you much, gentlemen.
Thanks,
Likewise.
everyone.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you all.
Happy New Year.
Bye now. Happy holiday.
Good to be with you all.